So with that said, my name is Kevin Poorman. I'm a developer evangelist with Salesforce, and I love unit testing. I think it's one of the things that makes me a better developer. I also like to run a little contest, so if you see me up here making a funny pose or something with my hands, take a picture of it, tweet it at me, you'll win a prize. All right, great. So this is the forward-looking statement slide. It's a massive wall of text. Hopefully you all can read it because it's enthralling. If you don't want to read it, I understand. It basically reminds me not to say anything about stuff that's not released, and you are reminded to only make purchasing decisions about what is currently available. Gotcha? All right, good deal. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about advanced Apex unit testing. We're going to look at test setup and test visible annotations. We're going to look at using CSVs for our data. We're going to talk about what it means to assert your sanity in a unit test, and we're going to stub some things other than our toes. And then my favorite one, we're going to talk about how DML is evil. All right? Good deal. First, what do we want from our unit test? Anybody want to throw something out there? I like to do interactive things. So what do you want from a unit test? I've got mine up here. What do you want?
Confidence.
Confidence. Great. What builds confidence in a unit test?
It works.
It works, and?
That's what it's supposed to.
And? It fails, but it tells us why it failed. It only fails in certain conditions, or only passes in certain conditions, and they're repeatable. Right? And this is the important part. You get confidence from the repeatability of a unit test. If it works 3/4 of the time, or as I like to refer to them, Cinderella tests, where at midnight they turn to pumpkins, then you end up having no confidence in your unit tests because you don't know if they're going to pass correctly or not. So let's talk about test setup and test visible. Is anybody using these already? This is the advanced Apex testing, but not everyone uses them. Not everyone's aware of them. So we have test visible, and what that gives you is the ability to, in a class, to see a private variable when you're testing. Right? So if you annotate a variable with test visible, when you go into your unit test, the next time around, in your unit test here, you can just access it as if it were a public variable. Does that make sense? Same thing with methods. You can do the same thing. In private method, you expose it as test visible. Then you can just write a unit test for that method in your unit test file. Nice and simple. But that's not all you can do with the annotations. You also have, I hit the wrong thing. You also have test setup. Is anybody using test setup? Like, what's the best thing about test setup? Yep, it's going to insert all the objects. My favorite part of test setup, though, is when you create a test setup method, if anything in there fails, if an exception is thrown anywhere in your test setup method, your entire test fails. So if you put your data generation in the test setup method, you're guaranteed that when you go into your unit test that your data is there as you expect it. That's a very important piece as we move into talking about using CSVs. Does anybody use CSVs for data? Yeah. The greatest thing about CSVs for data is you don't have to maintain them. Your admins, your business logic team, they can go through and they can add test cases to your CSVs. What that looks like is instead of putting this sort of code in your tests to actually drop a data in, you can actually load that from a CSV that looks something like this. This is a CSV of 3 accounts. And I'm going to load them all in my Apex code with a single line of code. You'll see the test load data bit here. And I'm going to give it the static resource name. And it'll load all those, create objects out of them, and insert them in the database for us. 1 line of code. Super fantastic. You do that in your test setup method. That way, if your CSV is missing or somebody's added a field or deleted a field that is required, what happens? The tests fail before you're even getting into, did it fail because my logic changed? No, you know it failed because your data is not there. Okay? So you can use these. They're pretty powerful, but the next question people are like, well, what if I have a tree of data that I need? What if I need accounts, contacts, and opportunities? Well, as it turns out, one of the neat tricks about these is you can do exactly that, loading them from CSVs, by adding in an ID field. When you create your CSV, if you give it an ID field, you can then give it any numerical ID. It doesn't really matter what it is, so long as those numerical IDs are relationally consistent. So here we've got an account at the top and a contact at the bottom, and you'll see that I've got an ID in both of these, but I also in the lower one have I have my account ID, and that account ID is going to reference the ID from this CSV. Okay, so when I go and do these, if I simply load them in the correct order, it will create my accounts, and then it will know to look at my contacts and find, okay, account ID, I have those accounts, here we go, and you can load entire trees of data this way. Is anybody doing this? Okay. This is one of my favorite tricks on the Salesforce platform for unit testing and data, because it's very powerful, and the best part is I get to hand off that test data creation to my business logic team, to other people, and when a new edge case comes in, and we've got a test with a new contact name with a funny character or something like that, I don't have to worry about that. They can just add that, and when I pass in my opportunities or contacts, etc., that's all mapped for me. So they're going to take care of all that for me. And when I go through to actually write my unit tests, I can write them in bulk. And what I mean by that is I can grab all of my, in this case, accounts, and test each of those accounts individually with the same unit test. This allows me to have a CSV of data that has all of my edge cases in it, and be testing all of my edge cases at once. Right? One test, 15 or 1,500 edge cases, all set up in the same place. That's my favorite CSV part of it. Now, I like to do this, assert your sanity. Does anybody know what I mean by sanity checks? Well, it works like this. The worst part about debugging a test or debugging problems in your code is knowing what you need to look at to see if it's working or not. So one of the things that I like to do when I write my unit tests is to put assertions in, like this one on line 7, where I'm going to double check that my data is there properly, or I'm double checking that I have relationships that make sense. I'm verifying that my test data is set up in a sane way so that when I go to actually test the logic of my code, I know that everything's there as it should be. So I like to combine sanity checks and the test setup method as a way of getting at both. So if it doesn't insert for whatever reason, I know that my tests are going to fail. And then when I get into individual tests, I can check that a relationship exists properly, etc., before I go into actually testing the logic of my code. This has saved me countless hours as I get a test that's failing and it's because something in the logic changed. I can go into my test to see that I've put a sanity check in and know that I don't have to figure out whether or not my data is valid, which works out nicely. Is anybody doing stubs and stub providers? This is another fun one. I like to do these. If you've done mocks, if you've done mocking. So if you've mocked an HTTP callout, you can be somewhat familiar with this idea. If you've ever written one callout mock provider as a factory, so that you have a HTTP callout mock factory that gives you these on the fly, you'll be very familiar with the idea of stubbing. So what we do is we create a stub, and a stub is going to give us a fake implementation of a method, okay, that we dictate all of the details of. So in our stub, we can say always return 4, right? Doesn't matter what the inputs are, it's always going to return 4, okay? Now, we can stub just about any method. You see there's a list on the side there, some caveats apply. Because of the way they work through dependency injection, you can't really do static methods because there's nothing to inject. You can't do properties because they're basically static methods, that sort of thing. You also can't stub a trigger, that sort of stuff. So beyond that, you can do anything that you're custom coding, you can basically write a stub for. When you do this, you're going to implement the stub provider interface. We'll see that in just a second. And you can write a stub provider interface that can handle multiple methods. So, and we'll see this before too. So what I've started doing in my development is I'll create a class, and I'll create the unit test class for it, and I'll create a stub provider class for it all at once. And then as I go in and I create a method in my class, I'm going to create a stub provider corresponding method so that in my unit test I can mock or stub any given method in my class. And it takes a little bit of forethought to start doing that, but when you do that, you immediately reap the benefits of your unit tests being much faster to write and also much faster to run. So let's look at what that looks like. This is, I'm sorry, I tried to make this bigger, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on here. So let me see if I can't highlight some of this. We're going to create a class called example stub mock, and we're going to implement this system.stubProvider interface. That system.stubProvider interface is what allows us to do the dependency injection and swap out one version, for a fake version of our method for the real version. And then we're going to implement this one method, and it's called handle method call. And you'll see that there's a whole lot of data coming in here. The stubbed object itself, the method name that's being called, the return type that is being returned, the list of parameters, and the list of arguments. So with that data, you can do a whole lot of interesting things, like look at switch on the stub method name. Now remember, I said you can do one stub provider class for all the methods in it. This is how you do it. You switch on the method name that is coming in. So if our method name is awesome method 1, we're always going to return a string, yay, called awesome method 1. Not terribly exciting, but this is an example of how you can control what happens when a stubbed method is called. Likewise, we have add two numbers. I'm going to always return 4. And then I'm also going to look at a polytype method name, which means that I've got two methods with the same name. One returns Boolean and the other one returns an account. I'm not sure why you would have that, but let's say you do. You can check not only on the method name, but you can also look at the return type. So you have all that data being passed in about the method call you're making in your code, about what's being called, what's being passed into it, what are your parameters, etc., and turn around and conditionally create your response to pass back. Is everyone seeing the utility and power and awesomeness of these? I'm not really selling it this morning, I'm sorry. All right, so these become really powerful, and once you've built the stub provider, you actually have to go about and use it. So we're going to implement this in 3 steps. We're going to look at a class that we're going to use. This is our date formatter, and it's going to say today's date is, and it's going to use a helper library to get the today's date, right? Not terribly exciting, but you'll notice that we're dependency injecting our date helper. Okay, this becomes crucial because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our class, date helper, and we're going to create a stub for it, in which case we've got our method here, get today's date, that's all we're doing, and we're going to create a stub that uses it, and it's going to look like this. Date formatter, date helper, and we're going to call our string to get date formatted date. And now when we create our mock, what we're going to do is we're going to create our mock for this that just says, here's our handle method call. Regardless of whatever we put in here, regardless of what our stub method name is, if it's called to get today's date, we're going to return a string, hello Dreamforce. Why hello Dreamforce? Why not? Right? We can return anything we want in our mock, in our stub. Okay? So in this situation, it doesn't matter what today's date is, we're always going to return a string that says hello Dreamforce. Okay? Now, here's what our test looks like, and you'll see that we've got a test method, pretty basic stuff. We're going to use this test.createStub method here, and we're going to pass in the class name we're stubbing and a new instance or a new mock. So we created that mock helper, or in that mock class that implements the stub provider interface. We're going to create a new instance of that class and pass that in along with the object type that we're stubbing, the date helper. We're basically saying our date helper object is going to be replaced with our stub object. And once you have that, you're going to be able to create a new date formatter. And when you go to use it, you just pass in our mock date helper. Does that make sense? Oh, hey, look at that. Power. All right. So this is how you use a mock a stub in your test. Here's when you should use a stub. It's a very simple question. If the code you are testing uses an injected object of any kind, you should stub it. Why? You want to venture a guess? Your stubs return a value that you code, and you can code that to have as little logic as possible. So it doesn't matter if you're doing a complex tax calculation in your actual method. You can stub that saying, always give me 4. Well, that's a lot faster. So your unit tests run faster when you're using stubs. Also, you may not be the only person developing in your org, and if somebody's got another method or something that they're doing in their section and you need to reference it, you can't always be guaranteed that you know that they've changed it. By stubbing it out, by saying use the stubbed instance of the account service layer object, you can be sure that you're always going to know that if even if that implementation changes, you're still going to be able to run your unit tests and pass if the data is sane. Does that make sense? The big thing here is this makes it a lot easier to write unit tests, a lot easier. It's not only when you're making callouts that you're going to have to mock it and do that sort of thing, but if you have long-running asynchronous processes like a batch job or something like that, you can mock out those batch calls as well. All right, so here's my absolute favorite one.
Usually when I write my test class, I also kind of test the depending classes with it. And when they fuck up, my test class fails, and this is kind of important.
Yeah, this breaks that, for lack of a better term, but that allows you to have actual unit tests. You're testing your code in isolation as opposed to an integration test. And at Salesforce, we've sort of mixed those two ideas together historically. But the power of a unit test is you know that your code is working as intended, even if something over here is changed, because you're stubbing it out. Now, because of the way the stub provider works, if the signature on that method changes, it will no longer fail. It will no longer invoke the stub, and you'll get your failure. But as soon as you've fixed the method signatures, you can be sure that your stuff is working as intended. So unit test versus an integration test. How many people spend a lot of time doing DML in their unit tests? Yeah, I don't really like DML. It's not my favorite thing. It's not my favorite thing because it's slow, right? The slowest part of any application built on the web is the database, right? Why? It's a shared resource. Even if it was just for you, you still have to, it's spinning disks, you're talking about lots of data. It's slow. So the question is, why do we have to do DML? And if we look at this here, we've got an account that we're creating, and we've got an ID. Now, does anybody notice anything weird about having an ID field that we're setting? You can't normally set an ID of an object, except about 3 years ago, API 35 or so, they created the ability for you to set the ID of an object with two constraints. One, it has to make sense as an ID. It has to be an 18-character string. That string has to have the right type, so an account has to start 001, right? And then you can't insert that object. So there's not a way for you to set the ID and then insert it. But this also gives us the interesting ability to not have to insert our data at all. So we can create a bunch of objects in memory and then pass those objects around, and as long as they have IDs, all of your referential checks between other objects will still work. So if we go back to our test setup method, we can drop a whole bunch of data in the database, or we could load that data from the CSVs and put it just in memory and then pass those objects around. Does that make sense? Now, the biggest thing we get out of this is your unit tests will pass typically faster than the UI will update to tell you it's running, which is a big thing for me. I like to know immediately whether or not things are working. So here we go. We can grab this. We can debug it. We don't necessarily have to put these in the database. And here's why. Here's sort of the checklist you can ask yourself. Are you testing anything that actually requires DML? And the only thing that I can think of that requires DML are triggers, process builder, and assignment rules. Somebody else got one? Between this and stubbing out methods, you should be able to create data, pass it around, and knowing that anything that's going to drop it into the database or pull it out of the database can be stubbed to return in the information you're looking for, you can get out of doing a lot of database interactions until you get into doing things like process builder triggers. Do you need to insert those records? If you don't need to insert them, don't. That's the simple question. And the biggest thing that I get out of doing this is, as I sit down to try and figure out whether or not I actually need to insert this, can my code be better architected to have these objects retrieved via a mockable or stubbed method, right? So if you are writing your software and you architect it such that your data is being grabbed by a sort of abstract class or a query builder class, if you stub that, you can have it return data automatically. You've never touched the database. So here's how you make it happen. You convert your tests pretty quickly and you just go in there and you say, okay, if I'm going to do an insert, do the insert. That's great, but make it optional in your test data factories. And you can turn around and you also say, I'm not going to insert anything in my tests. I'm going to take out those DML lines, run my test, and see where it breaks, and start looking at your code and your architecture to see whether or not you actually need to be inserting those. It's a little bit of a manual process, and a lot of things will break as you start to test it and convert things, but the payoff is pretty huge. Imagine being able to run all of your unit tests in 20 minutes rather than 14 hours. I have a friend of mine who works for a large company. They have 5 Salesforce instances, and their main customer service org, the unit tests take 22 hours to run. 22 hours. They've started implementing the no DML, and the unit tests that they've created after they sort of imposed that rule run in about 80 seconds. So huge bit there.
Here I have kind of the follow-up question. The first one, usually we do I test my class, because most classes are called from triggers, by inserting a record with the correct criteria and see if the trigger fires.
Yep.
You would say rather test the method itself.
And if you're using a trigger handler pattern where your trigger has just enough logic in it to call another class, instantiate a class and call another method, then what you can do is you can do DML-less triggers tests on your trigger handler, and then you have one integration test that actually inserts a record and makes sure that it fires. And in situations like that, I tend to do bulk, like 200 objects in my trigger right there, and then I'll have different edge cases in my trigger handler code. So I'm testing 2 kinds of different things at the same time.
Does the trigger fire itself? Like,
Yes.
did I forget to mention it? Or the
Yeah.
other one is does the logic work?
Exactly. Yeah. All right, so now we've come to the Q&A section, and here's the deal. I run this pretty easily. I'll answer your questions, and if you don't have questions for me, I'll start asking you questions.
Is there any out-of-the-box way to generate IDs within memory stuff, or do you just have to...
Is there a way to out-of-the-box generate IDs?
Give me a new valid ID method or something?
Yeah, I've seen people implement a factory for it. Give me ID for count. It's not brilliant. I don't know of an official way of grabbing that, because there's no API in Apex to get an ID short of actually inserting it, and then that gives it back. Yeah. So, I mean, I have my friend who, when they started doing this, they created 2,000 object IDs for every object they touch, and they loaded it as CSVs, and they, if it's an account test, they load the account CSV IDs, and they have those in the database there.
Valid IDs in the CSV stuff and avoid having to manually set it. So if you load one with Salesforce IDs in the ID field, are they already in memory?
Your Salesforce ID, you can't have a real Salesforce ID in the CSV because it will try to insert it with that ID. You have to have an obviously fake one, so it knows not to, because, yeah. Other questions? How are we doing on time? Oh,
So we mock a lot of HTTP like callouts. Any tips and tricks on some of the like JSON and XML and stuff we mock? It's crazy. Any recommendations on callouts, like mocking callouts?
So this is the part I had to take out of this presentation in order to make it short enough. I've got a whole thing about how you should have one HTTP callout mock factory class that is going to return the data you need. I use that in combination. I mark that as test, and I use that in combination with a test setup method in my mock class to load objects from CSVs for my various responses, and then I just return the response.
Okay.
There, why the CSV and not hard-code the values in the mock class itself?
I try my very best not to hard code anything. You could do it, and that's fine. The ability to load the results from a CSV, or even you don't even have to do a CSV. You could just do a static resource, and just have your JSON in a static resource and load it from the static resource. That sort of thing. The other thing that allows you to do, if you're using a mock factory, is the way you set up the mock factory. you can set it up so that it responds the first response, the second response, the third. You can do a sequence of callouts. Whereas if you're just using a one-off mock for the HTTP callout mock, you can only set that once in the unit test. So you have to write your factory in such a way that it will take a array of data and then return that data in sequence, so you can test a series of callouts. Because I don't know about you, but most of the time I'm doing a callout in a method, I'm actually doing 5 callouts. It's, authentication callout, do this, do that, that sort of thing.
Do you have any tips or tricks for like auto-generating any test code?
I use Faker a lot.
Faker?
Yeah, it's a website. I'm trying to remember. I think it's faker.io. And it has all these different, like you can pick first names, last names, cities, valid addresses. You just sort of create your CSV as you need it and click generate, and it'll give you up to like 1 million rows, I think. There's another one called Makito, or that mock. Yeah, if you search for mock data generator, you'll find all sorts of different ones. I use Faker though. I think just because I started using Faker like 10 years ago.
Is there anything that will generate like Apex test code for you?
No. No. And, well, here, ask this. Would you really want it to?
I mean, I think that there would be some use cases.
Okay. I want to, as a developer, I want to know exactly what's going on in my tests. So I don't want anybody to generate tests for me. That's my personal view on it. I want to be creating it so that I understand really what's going on. Because for me, part of writing unit tests is understanding what the hell my code is supposed to be doing. Right? I want to sit there and be like, okay, in order to make this code work, I actually need to create these inputs, and these have to be related to these things that I don't really need for this test, but I have to have, an account to have a contact. And really understanding the whole canvas of what my method is doing is, to me, the biggest benefit out of unit testing. Quickly followed by, as soon as I need to change something, I have a test to tell me whether or not my change broke. Anything else? We are running slightly over, so I'll just call Q&A there. Thank you for coming.